Oh yeah. Working? I think so. Hopefully they can edit all the random this first bit. All right. Well, welcome everyone. If I haven't come around and met you yet, my name's Emily. I help out just here with the leadership group of Women in Aid and Development in Canberra, along with Tabitha, who helps as well. So I know we've got a few people who are here for the first time tonight. So we might do some intros in a second. But I'd like to acknowledge that we're joining tonight on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I know there's been a few conversations happening around the voice with different people's roles and what's going on. So yeah, lots to talk about in that space at the moment. But yeah, maybe we'll just do a quick intros for everyone before we sort of get to tonight's topic, because we are a nice little small group. But yeah, so I'm the standards and code lead here at ACFID. So ACFID is the Australian Council for International Development. So we're a membership peak body for Australian NGOs that work in overseas development and humanitarian contexts. And so my role is around sort of standard setting and helping our members achieve good practice through ACFID's code of conduct. Yeah, that's me. Kirsten.
I work at the University of Canberra. Worked there for quite a long time. Pre that, I did speech pathology. Worked at the Canberra Hospital for a short time and had a private practice for a short time. Lived overseas for about 3.5 years in America, upstate of New York.
Nice.
Yeah. Welcome. Key points, I guess.
No pressure.
Hello, Sophia. I'm a public servant, born in Zimbabwe, and yeah, I've been in Australia for a little bit over a decade now. Just finished studying, so having an interesting conversation.
Congratulations.
Yeah, just submitted, and I'm really interested in moving or seeing what options are available moving into a more humanitarian space. Nothing wrong with public service, but I would like to challenge myself more, especially given my upbringing, to kind of leverage what I've learned during my studies. And my personal interest is in women and girls' health, health and well-being, and also in crisis settings or disaster settings. So the work is fascinating to me. So I'm interested to hear what everybody does.
Right here. I overheard you talking about your PhD, and it sounds really interesting.
Yeah,
it's very my name is Tabitha. I was an intern for Women in Aid and Development for their mentorship program last year, which was really interesting. Getting to kind of see how the matching process works and seeing some really incredible resumes. At the moment, I work for the National Indigenous Australians Agency. Working on the voice policy.
Wow. Okay.
So it's an interesting time, but a very exciting time as well. And keen to be able to talk about it in my personal capacity. I didn't put it on my
Hi, I'm Lucy. So I work at WaterAid Australia. Only moved to Canberra about 6 months ago. Before that, I worked at WaterAid UK. For 5 years, working fundraising, campaigns and communications. Previous to that, worked at the British Red Cross in kind of a similar role. So just really interested. It's my first time, so really interested to hear some more about this work and
so I'm Melissa. I'm here at ACFID as part of an initiative called the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, AP4D, which does what it says on the box. We bring together people from development, diplomacy and defence to look at key foreign policy issues. In a previous life, I did much more on the peacebuilding side. So a long time ago, I was doing peacebuilding in South Africa and working in New York on African peacebuilding issues and etc. Yeah, it's a long time. For quite a while, I've been doing Australian foreign policy. So I'm more on the diplomacy side, and every chance I get to network with and talk to fabulous people from the development side.
Well, we might come to you guys when you introduce yourselves and talk a bit more, but just to give a really short intro to Women in Aid and Development. There's a few of you who are new to this, but yeah, we've been running for over 10 years and we have events in Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne, and we've just started up in Brisbane as well due to popular demand. So the main aim of Women in Aid and Development is just simply to bring people together to sort of talk and support each other around their career path. Mainly, we focus on kind of trying to build networks and mentorships, as Tabitha mentioned, basically just to be able to learn from each other, and sort of sometimes it's hard to figure out how to get into the sector, and like once you're in there, what some of the different options are as well and everything. So yeah, that's kind of what we're set up to do. As you can see, welcome. No problem. We're a very informal group, and we often have, some really fantastic chats about different topics and hear from great people. And tonight is no exception. So I'm sure we'll get lots out of it. We got a chair over there. Yeah,
Sorry.
awesome.
You'll
You'll be feeling just fine. Yeah. No problem. Not to put you on the spot, but we just did some quick intros because we're quite a small group. But would you like to just introduce yourself really quickly?
I'm Fiona. I'm working for government at the moment, and studying a Master of Applied Anthropology and Participatory Development.
I'm an alumna.
Yeah, oh, really? Where were you up to?
Oh, just a second unit.
Well, look, I've been doing it for about 4 years now.
There you go. Good connection already.
Brilliant. Well, Fiona.
Thank you.
Yeah, just in time. We're about to start.
Sorry, I had
Oh, we
class
have a
at
person.
6 and
Oh,
Yeah.
oh.
sorry.
And I think we've had someone join us online as well. So hopefully you can hear us. Looks like Shushmita.
Hi, yes, I can. I'm sorry, I'm a bit late.
Can you hear us, Shushmita?
Yes,
Oh, it helps when I turn my
I'm sorry, I'm a bit late. I was running to get back home from uni, so yeah.
No problem. Welcome. So as you know, the topic for tonight is peace building and peacekeeping. And we have 3 fantastic and very expert panelists tonight who'll be able to share. I think from just chatting to you guys and having a look at kind of your blurbs about your careers as well, you obviously, I think, know each other and have lots of crossovers, but also different areas of expertise. So what we're going to ask each of them to do is just to share a little bit about their own kind of journey around peace building and what it means to them and where they've kind of come in their career, really whatever it is that they would like to share around this topic. And then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions of them as well after they each speak and keep going. So I'll give you a really quick intro to each of them if I can.
Otherwise you'll be here till midnight.
But yeah, your things are very,
But if
extensive.
we could all be here till midnight, given everyone's backgrounds here.
So Susan's gonna kick us off in a minute, but she's a civil military professional with experience in government, military and NGOs, and she specialises in gender and conflict, and is currently a PhD scholar at ANU. And she's also does a bit of work, executive director of Azadi Zan.
Yes, perfectly pronounced. Well done.
Excellent. An NGO dedicated to helping Afghan women's rights defenders escape the Taliban. So I know, lots to talk about tonight, but we might kick off with you, Susan, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. I thought, does anyone have issues with hearing? Are you okay with my mask? Is what I'm asking. Great. So I thought I'd open just with a bit of my kind of career trajectory in this idea of how we can all have interesting and varied approaches to life in the sector. I live with a chronic disabling illness. So my engagement in the sector is for the most part unpaid, but remains very, very fruitful. So, and I think there can, and I kind of, yeah, so I'd like to sort of lay out what that has looked like, and show how my experience might apply to others who might like to engage in unexpected ways. So I started my life in the sector primarily in a human rights capacity, but while I was doing my undergraduate degree, I realized that I actually wanted to specialize in conflict and development. And I got a bit of a rude shock when I was sort of analyzing my own views when the photos came out from Abu Ghraib prison during the Iraq War. And I had a very emotive response. And that response was actually one of hatred. And I found that quite unsatisfactory. I sort of had some very hard words to myself. And I said, Susan, you know, if you're interested in operating in this space, I don't think that's going to be very constructive. There are sort of, in the end, I decided that I knew a lot about the United Nations and its various organs and a range of different NGOs and other state organizations, but I didn't know really anything about the military. There are lots of aspects to military life that would have always appealed to me. I'd been a Girl Guide. I'd always loved being in the Scouts. In competition camps, I'd always loved hanging out with the boys, getting very dirty, working very hard. But to be perfectly frank, I had always considered that I would rather die than even kill someone in self-defense. But I realized that if I was going to, for my journey, I needed to understand more about the military in order to be able to continue a professional path in civil military, whatever it was. At the time, I wanted to specifically be working in conflict and development. So I joined the army.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I found it very interesting. I wanted to understand what it was to be a soldier. I wanted to understand what it was to be in an organization, you know, to what extent the organization really does want to sort of beat an individual down to, you know, make you up in their own mold, or to what extent they value diversity to be able to make sure that the team does have the capacity to kind of break through, you know, the complex challenges that we know exist in, you know, modern conflicts. And I learned a great deal. There were lots of things about that life that I found interesting and fun and enjoyable. There were lots of things that were very problematic and frustrating, infuriating, lots of kind of cultural practices and behaviors that were very problematic. But, you know, I did what I had wanted to do. I spent 8 years in the Australian Army. I was employed as a telecommunications technician. So basically I was like the Telstra person of the army, which meant that I also got a really good insight into the different types, you know, of activities happening throughout the military. So I was off in different parts, you know, I still got to understand who was doing what, because I had to be there, like giving them telephones or fax machines or whatever. Yes, the military is quite old-fashioned in the way it mostly uses. Yeah. And then I spent a significant amount of time that after a while they wanted me to be employed in their specialized civil military capability, which I enjoyed a lot. They recognized that I knew a lot about the other organizations that, you know, were in the same area of operations as them. And that was really interesting, but it was kind of weird because I knew a lot about those organizations, but in the military structure, I was very junior, and most of the other people in the civil military, it's called CIMIC, not junior, so it was quite a sort of a weird setup for quite a hierarchical organization. I finished my master's in international development at the beginning of the GFC. So the only job that I could get was as a grad for the Department of Defence. And I spent some time there doing some interesting work, some not so interesting work. But I did spend some time in international policy doing the peacekeeping UN and Europe team, working with some interesting countries, including supporting a visit by the head of the Swedish Armed Forces. They have really interesting civil military capabilities as well. Did an audit of Australia's support to the UN peacekeeping operations and UN headquarters. And also learned a lot about change management while I was there, which I found to be really interesting in terms of the value that you can have from your career when you do spend some time doing something that's not really what you really want to do. But as you spend time, if you want like kind of moving up in your career, there are a bunch of skill sets like finance or personnel that can be really useful to you as you advance in your career. Eventually, I finally got my dream job as the job that Jules Frost now has, and as the civil military advisor here at the Australian Council for International Development, and they seconded me to the Australian Civil Military Centre, which was lovely.
What year was that?
Oh wow, I'm not very good at time. I don't know. It was maybe 10 years ago. Yeah,
At least 10.
yeah. And we sort of we initiated the Women, Peace and Security, the body of work there around women, peace and security, and we was working very closely with Barb. I forgot to keep an eye on the time, and my phone has stopped. Yeah.
Okay.
We initiated the body of work, and so we began the annual civil society dialogues on Australia's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. So spent a lot of time bringing together NGOs when where appropriate, military organizations needed to pay attention to them. So sometimes it's really not appropriate. And I've spent a lot of the last sort of 2 years dealing with some of the consequences of that really firsthand. So especially, when international forces, for example, when international forces left Afghanistan, I don't know, they may or may not be an ACFID member, organization who had maintained very close relationship with the Australian Defence Force. When the military left Afghanistan, that put both their beneficiaries and their organisation in extremely high risk. So I had been working very hard trying to help that organisation plan the evacuation of some of their most vulnerable beneficiaries. But they continue to not necessarily follow some of that security advice. And so there are a range of reasons that I've seen throughout my career. There are a range of sets of guidelines around when to interact and when not to interact, and why those guidelines exist. And they certainly have come to the fore. I've seen them play out in places like the Congo, on both sides of the Burmese border in Thailand and in Bangladesh, in Ethiopia, in Uganda. Most recently been doing work from home, thank heavens for the sort of commercial off-the-shelf applications like Signal that allows us to communicate securely anywhere in the world. and yeah, to be able to continue to undertake activism and to organize, from my sofa in my pajamas, living with a chronic disabling illness that basically means that I'm not employable by a normal organization, but still able to contribute to the world of to women who are affected by conflict in various ways, and stay connected where possible to other organizations. And that doesn't even touch on the fact that I'm doing a PhD. But anyway, I thought that I could do a PhD as a means to be able to get a qualification that would allow me to be employed at a senior enough level that I could live on a part-time salary. But my health has continued to deteriorate such that that's not very reasonable when I'm pursuing a PhD for its own sake. And yeah, doing these other things along the way.
Brilliant.
Maybe I might just say, I think Susan's underselling herself. And you're changing lives of people from your sofa in your pajamas. In fact, you're probably saving people's lives, and not just one or two. So maybe you can ask her more later about that.
So far, at the last count, there was over 300 Afghan women's rights defenders and their families that we have settled in final destinations of safety. So, yes.
Yeah. I didn't know if you wanted to say the number, but
yeah. Thank you very much, Jules. Yeah.
Mind you, with COVID, most of us were on the couch in our pajamas.
true, for different reasons.
And if it wasn't for COVID, then the world wouldn't have, the world wouldn't have thought that it were possible. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Susan. Does anyone have any questions just leading straight on from that? There'll be time at the end too, but anything you want to follow up now? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. I actually did have one. Okay, don't mind. I guess I was wondering, like, you've been, and all of you, this will probably come up, but you've been in the kind of civil military space for a long time, and I wonder if you've seen, like, what you think are the kind of biggest changes that you've seen in terms of, has there been any shifts in how peace building is kind of thought about, or is it still kind of the same issues that you're seeing?
Well, I want to say something about this localization agenda. Like I don't know if I said that in a derogatory way or not, but I get a bit.
Your mask covers that.
I spent a lot of time with a diplomat who sings really great folk songs, and
I don't know why they call him a diplomat, because
he's not very diplomatic. But who worded the issue with such bluntness that I thought it was really relevant. There was discussion about the updates to the war memorial, including the point of view of Afghans. And he said, "Oh, no, it's it wasn't their war; it was our war. They just happened to live there." I threw up a little bit in my mouth, but the bluntness of it is, I think, very true. But the fact that the localization agenda, I think the fact that now that the question is being asked all the time, I think is very relieving, because it's stupid that there has been so long that it hasn't been asked, and that for so long that it wasn't the first and last thing that was considered, and that's something that I saw, even during my master's degree, or even before my master's degree, actually doing field work in Bangladesh and watching sort of international actors, operating on actually on the border with Burma, and the same thing, this fly in, fly out stuff. And I think that's watching with COVID, as well as there's been less ability to travel, but the ability to still have and make a positive impact, I think, and keeping kind of the who is most affected first and foremost in mind. I think that for me has been quite interesting to look at this.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, and we can certainly, I know some people kind of adjacent to the sector might not be familiar with sort of localization, what that's kind of referring to. So we can unpack that a bit later.
Oh, yeah, sorry, that was a bit too jingle.
No, I think you got to it with just that terminology. I'm aware sometimes myself. All right, Barb, we might turn to you. I'm going to attempt to summarize a long introduction to you, but
I think the older you get, the longer you buy it.
Okay.
The illustrative career.
Yes,
No, it's more.
So Barb has a master's in peace studies from the University of New England, and she spent 27 years working in WiAD on Pacific Island programs. And on UN and humanitarian peace and conflict programs as well, specializing in gender and peace building, violence against women, particularly violence against women in conflict situations. And immediately prior to her retirement from WiAD, she was the gender advisor and has carried out a number of consultancies focusing on kind of gender in crisis situations since then. And is very engaged in a bunch of different spaces as well, but I'll let you kind of expand on that too. Yeah, so thanks, Bob.
It's hard to know where to begin on a subject like this because it's so broad. So I'm not. I will talk a little bit about things that I've been specifically involved in, but I did want to, talk more in general about what peace building is and how broad a topic peace building is. Because there's a difference between peace building and peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is obviously part of peace building, but it's so I mean there was a definition of peace building in the advertisement for this, but just to be more in my line of thinking. Some of the definitions of peace building is a broad range of measures implemented in the context of emerging current or post-conflict situations and which are explicitly guided and motivated by a primary commitment to the prevention of violent conflict and the promotion of a lasting and sustainable peace. And that's the definition from International Alert. And there's also another one from Luke Reichler, who, if anyone's done any peace studies, you'll know who Luke Reichler is. But he's one of those, absolute experts. The overall aim of peace building is to transform conflicts constructively and to create a sustainable peace environment. Transforming a conflict goes beyond problem solving or managing a conflict. Through peace building, the conflict is not merely resolved, the whole situation shifts. Peace building refers to all the efforts required on the way to a creation of a sustainable peace zone. So we're talking about like before, during and after conflict. It's an ongoing process that doesn't have any specific beginnings and ends. It's something that's just completely ongoing. So,
Well, let's say if you walk over this way by the door. Okay.
We're all so fascinated. We're just
Sorry for those online. We're back in the light.
So, one of the and as far back as I can remember, one of the really frustrating things has been that all the peace processes that were going, like obviously the conflicts that were going on were largely involved males, but all the peace processes that did go on largely involved males, and especially the peace talks would only involve or the combatants, etc. So there was there were peacekeeping operations were largely military style operations anyway, until Cambodia, when Cambodia was the first of the multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations that involved civilians as well as military, and it had but there was nothing to do with gender or women or anything like that. So this went on for years, and there was there were various things that had happened especially during the 80s and 90s that I personally had some involvement with, and one was the very original coups in Fiji, which you probably weren't even born then. It was 1987 was the first coup.
I was going to ask how many of you were born in the 90s. Okay, so you got some in the 90s. Okay. Sorry.
So 1987 was when there was an election in Fiji, and the party that was predominantly an Indian membership won the election, and the Fijians were very disturbed by this, and Colonel Rambuka, who was head of the army at the time, carried out a military coup and overthrew the government, and that that was when I was working in Australia, and we had to stop any new things going on under the aid program to Fiji. And then a couple of months later, they had, I can't even remember what the second one was about, but they had an even more definitive coup. So then we cut off the aid program completely, and then various bodies met and then said later on that they could recognise states, not governments or something. And so that meant, because at that stage we didn't have an aid program to Vietnam, for instance, that had been cut off. So we had, so they were then able to put the aid program back on to Vietnam and Fiji. So I after having done the whole plan to cut off the aid program, I then had to do another plan to put it back on again. I mean, literally the next day. It was it was a nightmare. Anyhow, but one of the good things that came out of all that, and as you know, there were more coups later on in 2000, etc. But one of the good things that came out of was not right immediately then, but later on, the formation of FemLink Pacific, which was an organisation that was started by Sharon Bagwan Rolls, who some of you might have heard of. She was a qualified journalist, but she was more a sort of communications radio type journalist. So she started FemLink Pacific. And then later on, when Security Council Resolution 1325 came into being, which I'll go into later, she started up sort of other programs in Solomon Islands and Bougainville and Tonga, because they were having problems. So she is, and she's still going. She's still doing all these same things. So she's a truly amazing person. And though she's not FemLink anymore, she's the but also I can always get confused. GPAC or GCOMS. Anyhow, she's still very involved in all sorts of conflict prevention type stuff. So the other thing that was going on at that time, of course, back in the 90s, was Bougainville, and that was a very, very sad conflict. But again, it was women. There were women who were really there at the forefront of trying to stop all the fighting going on. And there was an organisation called the Tana Nahan Women's Development Agency, and a woman called Helen Hakina, who, if you ever tracked them down, they did wonderful work. And a nun, Sister Lorraine Garasu, who then not only was active then, but afterwards she ran programs to reintegrate the combatants back into society, or hopefully reintegrate them back. Because one of the other things that went on long after the conflict had finished was there were so many guns in the community, that the women were, and especially the younger women, were really concerned because there were rapes occurring at the point of conflict, point of a gun. You know, if they hadn't had guns, well, there might have still been rapes, but they wouldn't have had the guns to really enforce it. So, and then the Solomon Islands, again, women were during the ethnic tensions, as I used to laugh because some of the boys used to call it during the ethnic, they'd say. I didn't even say. So that was women who were very much, you know, out there literally in the jungle trying to stop the men fighting. And when they had the peace talks on the HMAS Tobruk, there were no women on board to participate in those peace talks. And when I said to some of the defence people afterwards, why were there no women there? I said, oh, we couldn't afford, we had to get the men, we couldn't afford to wait around to get the women. Well, the women were there knocking on the door, you know, it wasn't like they had to go and find them. And Alice Pollard, who, Susan, I don't know if have you ever met Alice? Dr. Alice Pollard. Yeah. Alice was the first Solomon Islands woman to ever get a PhD. And she was probably the most intelligent and sensible person in the whole Solomon Islands at that stage, or even still. She managed to get herself on board to make the tea, just so she could hear what was going on, you know. So, but I mean, they could, you know, she's the very sort of person they should have had involved. So all of, and then one of the things that really brought well, not so much brought it to a head, but was the Burundi peace talks back in 1997. And again, they said the women couldn't be involved because, quote, they weren't party to the conflict, quote, which is often the reason, you know, the peace talks often say, oh, you have to be a party to the conflict to be involved. So UNHCR somehow, and I've forgotten how they did it now, but somehow cleverly managed to get the women at the peace table. And that eventuated in UNIFEM, now UN Women, of course, beginning their well, I suppose it was a program on women at the peace table, and they produced a big report at that stage. So, so then in 2000, there was a big conference happened to be held in Namibia, and it was called the gender dimensions of multi-dimensional peace operations. And that produced a thing called the Vinderherk Declaration, because that's where it was held. And that was in I think May 2000. And then later on, Namibia happened to be the president of the Security Council for, you know, that keeps changing. And they came along, you know, I don't know if you saw in my bio, but I'm a member of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the oldest women's peace organisation, in the world. Started in 1915, when women from all sides of the conflict of the First World War met in The Hague to try and bring about an end to the First World War. And WILP had an office in New York, or still has an office in New York, just across the road from the UN. And someone from Namibia came across to our WILP person who in her office and said, how do you feel about having an open session of the Security Council where you can invite all, you know, NGOs, women, anyone to come and address the Security Council on peace, conflict issues and women's involvement? And Felicity, who was the WILP person, she said, oh, I jumped up, I ran down the corridor and I banged on everyone's doors because it was at the church. I said, just come listen. And so in September, that's when they had the open session of the Security Council. And
is that 2000?
2000, yeah. And that resulted in the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325, which we all just refer to as 1325 because everyone, and that became known as, well, it had two, I don't know, is everyone, I don't want to repeat all this if everyone knows all about 1325. It's two components to it. That was, one was the impact of armed conflict on women, and the other thing was, really importantly, was the participation of women in peace processes at all levels. You know, so this meant from the local right up to the international level. And it quickly got adopted by women all over the world. It just was like it got sucked up. You know, this is what we've been waiting for. I mean, it wasn't a perfect resolution, far from it, but it was the first time there was a Security Council resolution that focused on women. So, and it actually became known as the only Security Council resolution with a constituency. So, since then, there's now 10 Security Council resolutions on these aspects, and that's become known as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda with a capital A. So what in 2002, the UN Secretary General produced a report on 1325, and he, in that report, he asked that all countries produce a national action plan. And some countries did, they went ahead and did it. Australia didn't. And I was in AusAid at the time, and which wasn't part of DFAT then, of course. And I mean, technically we were, but we weren't on it. So I used to, every now and then I'd ask the people in DFAT, you know, who were relevant, can you know, are we going to get a national action plan on 1325? And they'd say, oh no, we don't have the resources to do that. And anyhow, it should be the Office for Women, women's business, you know. So it got dismissed and dismissed. And somewhere along the line, WILP managed to get a grant from the Office for Women, and we conducted consultations around Australia on what, you know, women around Australia thought of this. And it still sort of rumbled on, and, you know, nothing much happened. And finally, Sally Moyle, who some of you might know, Sally was actually the gender advisor in AusAid early on, and then she then got a promotion to be to Office for Women, and she managed to get the whole thing moving because Tanya Plibersek was the minister at the time, and she managed to get her to say to all the other relevant ministers, because the you know, there was DFAT and AusAid and Defence and Attorney General's AFP, etc. all involved. So finally, in 2012, we got a national action plan, and all of those departments were supposed to be implementing it, and, you know, producing implementation plans and things, which none of us civil society people ever saw, because I'd retired by then, and I couldn't even go to you know, any of the government meetings, because they'd say, you know, no, you can't come, you're retired. Damn. Anyhow, but what we did was I called a meeting of all the NGOs who might have an interest in or have some involvement in gender and peace building. And so something like 60 organisations, they all came to the meeting, and we just called it the NGO Forum. So I thought, if we're going to be asking the government to do things, then we have to know what each other's doing as well. So then we had a, I was trying to think of eventually it became, we had a couple of meetings of the NGO Forum, and then it was, that's when we decided to have the civil society dialogue with government, and we there was WILP, ACFID, UN Women, and the Civil Military Centre. And
no, they funded it.
They funded
the Gender Institute.
Oh, the Gender Institute. That's right. Yeah, the ANU Gender Institute. Yeah. So we did a proposal for a grant from the Civil Military Centre.
What year was that? Was that 12?
Would have been probably 12 or 13. I'm not sure which was. It was 13. I think was
good
the,
history. You're getting right here.
So the National Action Plan was a 6-year plan. So we did. For 6 years, we did, so 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 6, yeah. So for 6 years, we did the civil society dialogue with government and produced a report. Now, you can see those reports still on the Women, Peace and Security Coalition, and Civil Military Centre funded all of those for 6 years, which was great. And the report that we produced was, you know, partly a result of the dialogues, but also just in general and what we thought, you know, should be happening, because by 2020 it was in the 20th anniversary of 1325. There were various reports done, and I one of the have I got it here? I don't know if I've got the. There's too many things going on.
What are you looking for?
The thing from the
anniversary.
the anniversary. Yeah.
No, it's
Anyhow,
about this part.
yeah. Anyhow, I said, yeah. I had a quote.
Monica
I had a
Kumar.
quote from it. Yeah. Oh, the other thing I did mention was the first gender advisor in a peace operation was on TET in East Timor, and it was originally the design for that operation had a whole unit for a gender advisor, but then they cut the funding, and we only instead of a whole unit, came one gender advisor. So there was still a battle. You know, there's just always been battles. So what we've had, that National Action Plan finished in 2017 or 18, whatever the 6 years were.
Yeah.
And then the second National Action Plan was supposed to start immediately, but you know, and we had various meetings about it and all the things that civil society wanted to have in the next National Action Plan. We felt, you know, are we getting anywhere with this? And they weren't producing it anyway. So it finally came out. What, 2021?
2021.
Yeah,
About 3 weeks after I moved here.
That's right. I get not confused, but I get lost in the years. Anyhow, we finally got the second National Action Plan, and of course by then Oslo, you know, was part of DFAT. And
Is that you, Barb?
Sorry.
In demand.
Yeah. It's probably my grandson who's coming down from Brisbane tomorrow saying, don't forget to pick me up. He's not going to be happy with the weather.
Oh,
His sister was here the weekend before, you know, when it snowed out in Belconnen, and she was not amused. I don't have any winter clothes. Well, don't come to Canberra. Anyhow, but eventually, yes, I eventually got the second National Action Plan. So we're now doing a similar thing, thanks to the Civil Military Centre again. And we've had a series of roundtables around Australia, and we've had and we've produced a report on that, and then we had a sort of not a coming together of everyone, but the people who'd been the sort of leaders of the roundtable. So that's been that they got together, and now another report, which is just finalised today. So I haven't got copies of it yet. But the roundtables were asked. The question that was asked was, what do diverse women in Australia think? What do you think peace and security is? You know, what does it mean what does peace and security mean to you? And they were asked to come up with actions that they thought the government should take in order to make not just Australia, but the world a more safe and secure place. And the 5 actions they came up with were: enable all Australians to achieve peace, security, and their inalienable rights; reposition Australia as a global and regional peacemaker rather than a strategic military partner; rebalance priorities and restructure government departments and processes to enable Australia to become a world leader in global diplomacy, peace building and mediation; respect and recognise the agency of diverse women, girls and gender diverse people, and enable them, those most impacted, to lead; and position Australia at the forefront of global efforts to address climate change and insecurity. Because that's, you know, I mean, we all know the state of the world has become so insecure at the moment, and it's insecure in a you know, a military sense, but overlying that is the whole business of climate change, which could could be an even bigger disaster if things aren't. And of course, within the military context, there's all the threats of nuclear war. I mean, the world has become an extremely insecure place, and military action is not making it more secure. So that second point, that second action, reposition Australia as a global and regional peacemaker rather than a strategic military power, was the thing that we thought was really, really crucial. And to just enlarge a bit on this, participants wanted to see the government realise its commitment to making peace building a priority across Australia's foreign policy and diplomatic efforts, and to take a more vocal stance against international human rights abuses. At the same time, there were calls for the government to de-escalate tensions and improve relationships with Australia's neighbours, while modelling best practice in the Asia-Pacific region, significantly increasing direct support to Pacific women's organisations and peace builders was identified as an important way to achieve this. So basically what we're asking is for the Australian government to take a completely different stance, not necessarily take a completely different stance, but to take an equally important stance on peace building as on the military action. No one would ever be so optimistic as to suggest we shouldn't have a military. I mean, that would just, no, I mean, it's just, but wouldn't it be nice if we did? But wouldn't it be, wouldn't it be equally nice if as much resources were put into the peace building, diplomatic, all that side, not just diplomatic at the government level, but peace building at all, you know, at the local, the national, the international level. What we, I mean, when you look at what is spent on the military, like, are you familiar with SIPRI, the Swedish Institute for Peace Research? They produce the report on funding for military globally, you know, globally and throughout the countries. And in 2022, the amount of money spent on the militaries was $2,242 billion, US billion, which is actually, you know, US 2.3 trillion. Sorry, which is a huge amount of money. Australia obviously doesn't spend anything like that, but nevertheless, our funding is going up by about $2 billion every year. So we're 52 billion this year, 54 billion next year. And you might, I don't know if you saw the launching of the Defence Strategic Review recently, and I've got the. I'm not going to attempt to read. This is funny, half of it, because actually half of it has got pictures. Every second page is a big picture, and each time there's a picture of an individual, it's always a woman. Every one of like there's other pictures of you know, equipment and all sorts of things, but it's because Defence put a huge amount of money into recruitment, 75 billion or something a year, million they spend on advertising for recruitment. And if you notice any of the ads on TV, so often they're about women joining the military. Now, this is not what peace building is about. I want less men in the military, not more women. So sorry, this could go on for hours, and I won't. We'll put in a whole submission to the strategic review, yeah, which you can see on the WILP website if you're interested. And but the interesting thing to me was at the end of the launch of the review, there was Anthony Albanese was launching it, and then at the end, you know, there were journalists asking questions, of course, and he said, in answer to one of the journalist questions, which I couldn't read, you know, you can't quite hear what the journalists are saying, but he said, and I quote, "The real answer is peaceful dialogue." And so they know what the answer is. but they don't do it. And so anyhow, on that note, I'll stop because I can. Otherwise, we really will be here till midnight.
I feel like it's been on a roller coaster. 101 Peacebuilding, that was fantastic.
Sorry, there's an awful lot more.
No, I'm sure we could sit here for hours and digest any one of those points or kind of
This
conflict that
is
you've
another
raised as well.
one that you really should have a look at if you can. It's the
Mhm.
militarisation of Australia, normalisation and mythology, because one of the, you might notice that every time there's a natural disaster, they have the military out there. And it always looks as though there's lots of military out there and people think, oh, it's really good they're out there looking after us. But in fact, well, too, the military have 3 levels of they have one level of people who are actually sort of on active duty. They have one lot who are preparing to go, and there's another lot who are sitting around waiting till whatever has to happen. And it's that batch who are sitting around waiting who get used for the natural disasters. And it's never more than about 500 of them. And they used it for the COVID as well. The defence strategic, and we've always said we don't want the military doing this. We want a properly resourced civilian capacity to prepare and respond to natural disasters. And in fact, the one thing that we really agree with in the strategic review is they said we don't want the military being involved. It's not the role of the military to do this, and in fact, it's not the role of the military to do humanitarian action either. When I was working in the humanitarian section of AusAid and had a lot to do with the CIMIC stuff and humanitarian action. And the military, the ADF has a whole series of priorities, and war fighting is their top priority. And the humanitarian action was right at the bottom, saying if we have the capacity, if we have the resources, So it's not something that they wanted to do, and they certainly don't want to do domestic disaster relief. So there's a lot of acceptance of military presence and action and all the rest of it that people just don't. I mean, even people who should, I'm surprised that would often say, oh, it's really good the military out there helping us. Well, yeah, and we'd often, of course, you'd have to rely on their big equipment for any like ships or planes for evacuations or things like that. But it would be so much better to have a proper civilian capacity. Anyhow, that's getting off the track of
It's a good segue.
Do you mean people that are especially trained?
Yeah, well, you've already got the firefighter, the rural fire services and the, the paramedics and all this. I'm not saying there should be one organisation to do it, but there needs to be more resources put into the equipment and training and coordination and all the rest of it. And you can, it's not difficult to do. Well, it is difficult, but it needs money to do it.
Yeah, it does.
Well, thank you, Barb, for that. And I think it is a nice segue. It was sort of, really interesting to think about as well, kind of the role of those national action plans, that sort of even, international kind of resolutions and how that drives change and if it does, like in different ways. So I think, really interesting viewpoint at that kind of government sort of level. So thank you. But Jules, I'm going to turn to you now and follow on. So let me quickly introduce Jules. So Jules is the Civil Society Engagement Advisor of the Australian Civil Military Centre, where she contributes to the advancement of national capabilities to prevent, prepare for and respond more effectively to humanitarian crises. She's an executive with over 25 years experience in international humanitarian contexts. She's been in Canberra for 2 years since arriving from Switzerland. And she's worked with organisations like World Vision, MEDAIR and the CHS Alliance, and lots of others that, you can tell us more. Over to you, Jules. Thanks.
So thanks so much. And I almost think it's as if we planned what we talked about, but really Emily reached out to us and I know these wonderful individuals, but we haven't planned. And as I was listening to you, Barb, I needed to have a coffee with you about 2 years ago to get more of the history of Australia with the National Action Plan, but I'll come back to that. So, and also reflecting as I was driving here, I was like, I say I've been in it for 25 years. And then I was like, oh man, it's almost 30.
Yeah.
That's why, and I was like, is that 30? And I was like, yeah, 2024, it's 30 years, which I started when I was 10. So, you know, it's okay. I'm like, do I look like that? Possibly. But that's why I was going to ask you, you know, how many were born before the 1990s? Anybody here? Okay, so there's a few of us. So I'm proud to say I was before that. We won't say how much before that. But I was doing my undergraduate work. So I'm American and had a passion. I thought I was going to go into law. And then I found out about South Africa and Nelson Mandela. And I was like, I want to be a peacemaker. Very inspired. And I went to University at Pepperdine University in California and realized after my first year, I hadn't taken any of the prerequisites to law that maybe I was changing my mind. And I won't stay on that too long, but I ended up doing communications. And then during that time, and this is what's so interesting about something I learned tonight, I had the opportunity to go to Africa between my junior and senior year. And then I went again after I graduated. And I went thinking I might die in Africa, you know, deepest, darkest Africa. The HIV/AIDS virus was not fully understood. It came from monkeys in Uganda. And, you know, we were scared and I was going as a university team and we were going to work to help build housing for orphans and widowers in Uganda post Idi Amin. Back in the day, you guys will be like, that movie. Yes, my life has been shown in a couple of movies, which we'll talk about. We also, after we went there, and yes, Africa was not what I thought it would be, and I fell in love with Africa. And we ended up in Namibia, which was planned as well. And I worked in a resettlement camp of returnees coming into Namibia to vote for what ended up being independence from South Africa. So this was in 89. And one team went to South Africa, and I thought they're going to get themselves thrown in prison. So, because it became very activist oriented, they did not get thrown in prison, but I chose Uganda and Namibia. And I found out about peacekeepers. They were protecting the camp that I was digging sewage canals in. And they loved our team because we knew how to play volleyball. And that's when I came face to face with Kenyan peacekeepers. And I don't know who else was the majority. I can't recall, but it was Kenyans. And thus started more of the journey for me about peace building, conflict, humanitarian assistance. And I went back and was finishing my public relations degree. And I was I had gone with Youth for Christ, and Youth for Christ Namibia said, look, we've gained independence. Do you want to come work with us and work with high schoolers that need to figure out how to relate to each other because the high schools had been segregated? And so I went to a town called Swakopmund. Initially, I was in Windhoek, where I did not know that meeting was held. And I was like, I didn't know in 2000 that that's where that emanated from. But what I can tell you, when I was there in 90 to 91, the first US embassy was opened and it was a woman. And I thought, I can be an ambassador if this, you know, and I was so this was, how did that work? So I'm off timing a little bit. Maybe that happened when I was there the first summer. So anyway, I got an invite to go after I graduated to work there for a year, to the demise of my parents, because here I had this major degree, owed a lot of money, and then I asked them for their Christmas card list to raise support and defer my loans. Well, I did go. But before that, in my last year of undergrad, I had an opportunity. I was taking a course that was around propaganda. And this professor was probably one of my best professors. And you had to create original thought. And I'm like, well, how do you do that?
Yeah.
You know, isn't it that you read and you regurgitate and this is how you learn? And I ended up learning about Namibia and the conflict that had happened there, and one of the parties named SWAPO, who and how they used propaganda. Well, it ended up, I met some of those people and invited them to the university campus. And I was then told that possibly I was inviting terrorists onto campus, and what was I doing? But they ended up being in power after independence. And when I went back after I graduated and was working for there for a year, the Minister of Education was one of the gentlemen that I had at the university. Now, I share that because in my career of less than 30 years, one of the key things is relationships. And it's relationships that you might never expect will show up again in your career. And that also is a critical thing, I think, in peace building. It's about, you might be encouraged, network, get as many business cards as you can possibly do and get your LinkedIn and all of this. But it's really about cultivating relationships and finding that one kind of commonality that you might have or interests that you can build a conversation about. Because you never know where they're going to come. And I've got a couple more stories that then tie with some movies. Not that I've ever been in any movies. So flash forward, I do this thing in Namibia, and that was Jules's self-created Peace Corps, which was a critical element of you having overseas experience to be able to get into the development sector in Washington, D.C. Now I came back and I was like, all right, well, what am I going to do? I need to make some money. And I'm sleeping on couches of friends, and we're in the financial crisis. And who needs public relations? Nobody's hiring for that. But I get a job at an advertising agency, and my client was World Vision. I couldn't have planned it. And how that happened was one of the guys who organized our trip in the summer to Uganda was working there, and he decided he wanted to become a doctor. So he said, I think you're exactly what they need. And I got the job. And when I was there, I was like, I don't want to write about this. I want to do it. But then I'm like, I have a public relations degree. How am I going to get to do this? So I put all the eggs in one basket and thought.
Can I just say, so I first met Jules when she was at World Vision.
Oh. So it's so interesting how the stories weave. Yeah. And so what happens? So I'm at the advertising agency for World Vision. So I don't work for World Vision. I'm writing about it and trying to raise money from an advertising agency perspective. And we developed the whole thing of putting seed packets in your post and then getting them sent back. We don't do that anymore, but we thought that was very clever back then. And I'm sure coming out of some of your background. Yeah. So I should speed up. Do we end at 8 or 8:30?
Okay.
8? Okay. So
10 minutes.
okay, I will speed up on this front half, but it's really forming and hopefully helpful as you're thinking about your career and how things can go maybe unplanned, as you were saying. So what happens? Advertising agency, I don't want to write about it. I put all the eggs in a basket and apply for American University to do my master's. And I was like, international communications, I'll do that. And in that degree was cross-cultural understanding, conflict negotiation, and then tech. I hate to say it, in my tech class, we had to try and get on the web. It was a black screen and you really had to work, and I was miserable at it. But also at the same time was the promotion of satellite networks, and Africa was very unconnected. And boy, I had this idea that every African should have a mobile phone because it was going to be elections in South Africa. Well, darn it, I should have created some kind of IP on that and made a lot of money. I wrote a paper about it before it happened, but that doesn't really matter. So what ended up happening when I graduated out of there, half of us in my course went into the IT world and made lots of money unless they got stuck when it broke. And the other half went more into development, political, diplomatic, etc. And I was fortunate that I got a graduate internship at the US State Department in the Bureau of African Affairs. And I got top secret clearance. I didn't do a lot, but I saw a lot and I met people. And the first thing that I worked on was Angola, as peace was trying to be negotiated on Angola. And I'm like, where's Angola? I mean, I knew because it was on the border of Namibia and I crossed the border, but did I really know the political parties and what was happening in Angola? No. So that was challenging. And then Somalia. And if you've seen the movie, I forgot about this movie, Black Hawk Down.
Yes, I've watched it about 6 times. It's my favorite movie.
Okay. Well, very interesting
I
setting,
love
Barb.
it. I mean, it's just really interesting.
Yes, well, so I was working with the special ambassador. Oh, we might just run out of battery on me. And that's just, that's fit for purpose. So what happened was I got appointed to support this special envoy under the Secretary of State. Who was Ambassador James Dobbins. Oh, we're back on. And he was charged with bringing the soldiers home, the US, out of Somalia after that happened. And I happened to be doing my master's thesis on Somalia and the mistakes the US government had made in not understanding the culture and exacerbating the conflict. It had unintended negative consequences. And that's a key thing when we engage in peace building, development, diplomacy, and further down the track, I had an opportunity to work with a woman named Dr. Mary Anderson, who maybe some of you have come across. She is the pivotal author of taking the concept of do no harm in medical ethics and bringing it to the humanitarian sector. And really about looking at how do you not exacerbate conflict, power imbalances, inequities, etc., and understanding your second and third order, as the military would say, effects, unintended consequences. I'll come back then. So Somalia happens, and then there was this incredible woman working in the front office of State Department, Ambassador Prudence Bushnell, and she was the principal ambassador when Rwanda broke out. And I so admired this woman. And she had asked me before that happened, I had said, oh, can I do some work for you on this intern? And she was working on AIDS and women in Africa at the time. So I got positioned to do all this research in a library, which basically killed me because I'm very, if you were going to ask me about my skill or what, engagement with people. I thrive and be energized on that, where some people on research, please don't have me do that. But I met some very interesting women who then went on to be critical leaders in the AIDS epidemic and working on those issues. But Ambassador Bushnell became a mentor to me and remained so for many years after. And she's now a consultant and went on to do leadership training in the Foreign Service. But before she did that, she basically was the strongest voice within the State Department when the Rwanda genocide happened and things needed to change. And it was an uphill battle. And that was when Clinton was there, and well, we know what happened. And I sat in a lot of meetings in secure places where I couldn't believe what it was taking to get things to happen. And what you read in newspapers versus what is actually happening, they're really can be two different